Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. A couple weeks ago, we planted all these tomatoes together, and today, they've been in the ground for a few weeks. It's time to talk about caring for our tomato plants. I'm going to walk you through how I maintain them and how I keep them healthy to get a nice long season of abundant harvest. So you can see these tomato plants here. So far, they're looking really nice and healthy, and the goal is to keep them that way and to maximize the fruit that they're going to produce for us. So the first thing I want to talk about is supporting tomato plants. You can see that I have this welded wire fence here, and I allow my tomato plants to grow up that fence, and that's how I support them. Now, supporting your tomato plants is going to be, to some extent, a matter of opinion, but most people that grow tomato plants do agree that you tend to get healthier plants, better yields, more usable fruit by supporting them. So I do prefer to support my tomato plants, especially indeterminate tomato plants, because those can get really tall. Now you can see that I use these little plastic ties to tie my tomato plants to the fence here. Tomato plants are not natural climbers. You know, if you grow something like cucumbers or beans, they'll wrap their stem or their tendrils around the fence and basically support themselves as they grow. Tomato plants are natural sprawlers, not climbers. So as they grow, I need to tie them. So you can see this one's getting pretty tall. So what we're going to do today is we're going to add another tie up here and support it a little bit farther up. There are lots of different options when it comes to supporting your tomato plants. I really like this fence because for me, it allows me easy access to my tomato plants. It allows them to grow nice and tall, and it frees up a lot of ground space here. As you can see, I have lots of other plants growing in this ground space here. I find that for me this works the best, but people have lots of different other options when it comes to growing tomato plants, so let's take a look at a couple other options you could choose from. One very common option that you'll probably see recommended is the tomato cage. Now you can see I do have these tomatoes growing in tomato cages here. These are cherry tomatoes. Because I grow these cherry tomato plants, a little bit differently than the large slicer tomato plants that we looked at before, I find that tomato cages work well for me for cherry tomatoes. You know, the fruits aren't going to get as large. I also allow my cherry tomato plants to get a little bit more bushy and kind of sprawl out a little bit more than I do allow my large slicer tomatoes to do. So for that, I find that a tomato cage works well for them. The benefits of a tomato cage are that it's very easy. You just plop it in place, you stick your tomato plant in there, and then you just allow it to grow. I do find that these tomato cages, in my experience, don't offer enough support for large slicer tomatoes, especially indeterminates that are going to get really tall with really heavy fruit as the season goes on. So that being said, I have definitely used tomato cages for other tomatoes in the past, and even this year I am using it for a couple tomatoes, but I know that it is not ideal, so it's kind of a make do and a pinch situation. But I do find that it works well for these cherry tomatoes, so these will continue to grow in cages. Now let's step over to this next tomato bed here, and you can see yet another option for supporting tomato plants. You can see these are all Roma tomatoes of various types. These are determinate tomatoes, and I'm using stakes to support them. You can see with the stakes, I have to tie the tomato plants to them the same way that I do to the trellis wall, because these tomato plants will not grip or climb the stake. So I think that here's a good spot to talk a little bit about the differences between determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. Indeterminate tomatoes are tomatoes that basically produce an indeterminate amount of fruit. So an indeterminate tomato is going to keep growing the entire season. If you take good care of it, if it has fertile soil, enough sunshine, enough water, basically if all its needs are met, they can get very tall. Most years my indeterminate tomatoes all end up being significantly taller than I am. And I find that they'll just keep growing. They'll keep setting new fruit as the season goes on. Determinate tomatoes are a little bit different. Determinate tomatoes usually don't get as tall. I find that these tomatoes here, they don't get as tall as I am. They maybe get 3-4 feet tall, but they're not going to get 8 or 9 feet tall the way my indeterminate tomatoes do. Another difference is that determinate tomatoes basically ripen all their fruit at once. You can see that my determinate tomatoes here are starting to flower. They have a few little clusters of flowers, and they will continue setting flowers and setting fruit as the season goes on. But what's going to happen is they're not going to ripen these fruits until the entire plant is ready, and then all of the fruit will ripen within a matter of a few days to a few weeks of each other. Determinate tomatoes are really popular when it comes to sauce tomatoes or processing tomatoes. If you're planning to make a big batch of tomato sauce or salsa or something like that, it's a lot more convenient to have all of your tomatoes coming in at the same time for processing. Where if you're looking for something for fresh eating, you just want cherry tomatoes to snack on as the season goes on, or you just want slicer tomatoes for your sandwiches, it makes more sense to have an indeterminate tomato because it's going to yield for you over a longer season, and you're not going to get all your fruit at once. You'll get a couple tomatoes here and there, and then a couple more tomatoes, rather than dozens of tomatoes coming in all at the same time. So here's a look at another trellis wall with tomatoes growing on it. You can see this is similar to the other wall that I showed you. So these are all indeterminate slicer tomatoes. You can see I have these tied to the wall. And these are going to grow similarly to the others, and they'll keep growing to the top of the wall and most likely above the wall as well by the end of the season. So as far as securing your tomatoes to their support or to their trellis, you have a few options there too. For tomato cages, I don't really worry about it. As I said, I mostly just grow cherry tomatoes in the tomato cages. But when it comes to stakes for my determinate tomatoes or my trellis walls for my indeterminate tomatoes, this is what I use just because it's really easy, very convenient, very cheap. If you want to save a little bit of money or you want to use reused materials instead, you can use old strips of a t-shirt or something like that to tie your tomatoes up. I do find you want to avoid using something that's really rigid. I wouldn't suggest using twine or something like that. If you do use something like twine, make sure that you tie it loosely, because otherwise, as your tomatoes grow, the twine can kind of cut into the tomato stem and cause a little bit of damage to them as they grow. So I've shared with you the different tomato support ideas that I use in my personal garden, but there are lots of other ideas out there you could look into. You could look into the Florida weave method. Could look into a trellising method where you have a pole that goes across the top of the bed, string coming down, and you kind of wrap the tomatoes around the string as they grow. Those are great options that can work really well depending on your personal gardening and maintenance style, depending on your climate, and just depending on the layout of your garden. Different things work better for different people. So I definitely recommend, if you're just getting started with tomatoes, try out a few different options and see what works best for you. And then eventually you'll come up with the style that works best for you, or you may end up like me and still use multiple support options in the same garden. It's something else that you're going to find pretty hotly contested. There are a lot of different opinions in gardening spheres about pruning as well, but today I'm just going to share with you what I do. So pruning is something that you're going to approach a little bit differently depending on what type of tomato that you're growing. I'm growing indeterminate slicer tomatoes, I'm growing determinate sauce tomatoes, and I'm also growing indeterminate cherry tomatoes. I'm going to prune each of those types of tomatoes a little bit differently, although there will be some similarities. So I'm just going to go through these tomatoes and share with you what I do to care for each one. So indeterminate tomatoes are probably what is most commonly grown in the home garden, so we're going to start with those. The first type of pruning that I want to do, and this is the same across the board for all of my tomato types, is to prune off these lower leaves. You can see these lower leaves tend to not be as healthy as the beautiful top growth, and I want to promote airflow in my tomato plants, and I also want to minimize splashback from the soil onto my leaves, which can carry tomato plant disease. So we are going to go ahead and prune, if I can get an angle for you, prune this branch off as well, and also this branch. So as the tomato plant grows, I want to continue removing bottom leaves until the top maybe foot to 18 inches or so is bare of leaves. That's going to help prevent the spread of tomato disease. Tomato disease is often born in the soil, and as I mentioned, can be spread to the plant by when you have heavy rains, the soil will splash back up on the leaves, and that can definitely increase the spread of disease. Additionally, the lower leaves are usually the first to get sick in a tomato plant. That's also just going to maximize airflow for the plant, and more airflow equals more disease resistance. So as you can see, this tomato plant here, we've pruned off several lower leaves, and as it grows, I may prune off one or two more leaves, but we're going to leave it as it is for now with this amount of top growth because that's a good amount to support the plant. Now that aspect of pruning, removing the lower leaves, is the same for all the types of tomato plants that I mentioned. So I'm going to go through my whole garden, my indeterminate slicers, my indeterminate cherry tomatoes, and my determinate sauce tomatoes, and I'm going to remove all the lower leaves. You will notice when this plant is pretty large and can handle having several leaves like that removed. I have some tomato plants that are a little bit smaller, and in those cases I may not remove any leaves yet, or I may only remove 1 or 2 depending on size, and as they grow I will continue to just prune off some lower leaves just to maintain plant health. One thing I do want to mention is you'll notice that I'm using pruners for these plants. Now, it is true you could pinch off these leaves if you want to, but what I find is that tomato stems are very stringy, and if I just pinch off these leaves with my fingers, I'm a lot more likely to accidentally remove a strip of the stem. You know, if you kind of just pull off the leaf, a lot of times it'll basically pull a stem off the entire length, or it'll pull a strip off the entire length of the stem along with it, and now your tomato plant has an open wound that all kinds of disease and bacteria and fungi and all kinds of things can get into and infect the tomato plant. We really want to minimize that, so I find that pruners give the cleanest cut for removing leaves. One other aspect of pruning that I want to mention is removing suckers. You can see right in the armpit here, between the stem and the branch, you can see this little, basically it's another little stem forming right in the joint between those. That's called a tomato sucker. Whether or not to remove tomato suckers is basically what I was referring to when I said that pruning tomatoes is pretty hotly debated in the tomato growing community. Now, what will happen if you allow that sucker to stay on the plant? It's going to grow at an astonishing rate of speed and basically turn into another main stem. Depending on your goals and depending on your growing conditions and your garden setup, that may not necessarily be a bad thing. But for the most part, I prefer to remove tomato suckers. Sometimes I'll allow 1 or 2 to grow per plant, but what'll happen is basically if you allow your plant to grow unchecked, in every joint between the leaf and the stem, it's going to produce a sucker. Once those turn into a main stem, they're going to have their own leaves, and within the joints between that new main stem and the branches, the leaf branches, those are going to grow more suckers, and before you know it, you have a huge bush of a tomato plant that's really crazy and out of control. Now, that's how tomato plants would grow in the wild. They would grow like that and just kind of sprawl along the ground, take up a large amount of space. The problem with that is that really leads to the spread of disease. It really leads to a lack of airflow. It leads to fruit that is basically just on the ground, and creatures can come easily nibble on the fruit. So I find that overall it makes the plant healthier if you remove at least most of the suckers. So when it comes to indeterminate tomatoes or indeterminate slicer tomatoes, that's what I like to do. Now, when the suckers are really small like this one, I can just kind of pinch it with my fingernail and pull it out. You want to make sure to actually pinch it off and not tear it for the same reason that I mentioned with removing tomato stems. But what could happen, take a look at this here. See this second stem here? This is the original main stem of the plant. This is a sucker that I missed just for a few days. We were out of town for a couple days, and by the time I got back, this was so large that I decided not to remove it at this point. So probably what I'm going to do with this plant is allow it to grow a second main stem and tie them both independently to the trellis here. You know, I did mention that occasionally I will let a second main stem grow. So we're going to do that. With this plant here, I don't want it to have any more main stems than just these 2. So I'm going to have to be extra vigilant about removing suckers from this plant here. So right here, you can see this is how the suckers start out, and at this stage, they're pretty easy to just pinch out. But you can see here, I've got another one I have to remove, and up here behind the blossoms is another one. So it's very easy for tomato plants to get out of control very quickly. When it comes to cherry tomatoes, I take a little bit of a different approach to pruning the suckers. Now, with the large slicer tomatoes that we were just looking at, what generally happens is that by pruning the suckers, you may actually end up with fewer fruits, but you're going to end up with those fruits being larger, and you most likely will end up with some fruits sooner. With cherry tomatoes, the fruits are going to be pretty much the same size no matter how you prune. And by pruning out too many suckers, I find that you may actually end up minimizing your cherry tomato harvest. So sometimes I'll prune out the first couple suckers on the base of a cherry tomato plant. basically while the plant gets established, and then after that I'll just kind of let them go a little crazy. So you can see here the base of one of my cherry tomato plants. These little suckers growing in here, I'm going to pinch out the first couple. And then as we get farther up the stem, you can see there's some more here and actually quite a large one here that I missed. I'm just going to let these grow and let the plant get a little bit more bushy. Now when it comes to these lower leaves here, we're going to clip these off just like we did the larger tomatoes. So here I have all my determinate tomatoes. These are my sauce tomatoes. I'm going to prune these a little bit differently because they are determinates. Now I still am going to clip off these lower leaves just like I do for the determinate tomatoes because again, these are the most likely to get diseased. So clipping these off will allow the plant to stay healthy a little bit longer. But what we're going to do differently is you see these little suckers growing in here. Because this is a determinate tomato, we're going to leave these suckers. So determinate tomatoes, as we talked about before, have a little bit of a different growth habit than indeterminates, and they yield a little bit differently. With indeterminate tomatoes, basically with all tomatoes, each sucker has the chance to produce fruit. So with indeterminate tomatoes like these, because they're going to keep growing as long as the season allows, the main stem can continue producing fruit, and eliminating the suckers isn't going to substantially affect our overall tomato harvest. While with determinate tomatoes, since they only have a specific size they're going to grow to and they only have a set amount of fruit they're going to produce, eliminating those suckers is going to be cutting down on the overall potential harvest. So with determinate tomatoes, we want to leave the suckers in place, otherwise we're going to be negatively impacting our harvest. One other factor that I find really important with promoting healthy tomato plants is mulch. There's a couple of reasons why this mulch really helps our tomato plants to stay healthy. We've kind of talked a little bit in this video about how the negative impact of soil splashing up on the tomato leaves and how that can lead to the spread of disease. One of the benefits of mulch specific to tomato plants and other disease-prone plants is that it provides a barrier between the soil and the leaves. So even with heavy rains, this mulch that I have here is going to be minimizing the amount of soil splashing up on the leaves, and that is going to at least delay the onset of disease and hopefully prevent it altogether. One other really important benefit of mulch is water conservation. And this is true not just of tomatoes, this is true of all vegetables that you'll grow in your garden. It is really important, especially if you're in an area where you don't get as much rain. It's really important to conserve soil moisture as much as possible. So you can see this mulch here generally looks dry, but if we move it aside and look at the soil underneath, you can see that there's moisture in this soil, and this mulch is really preventing a lot of that moisture from evaporating due to the sun, which is conserving the amount of rain that we get and also reducing the amount of supplemental watering that I have to do. And talking about watering brings me to the next tomato care tip that I want to share with you, and that is bottom watering whenever possible. Now you see my tomato plants are out here. They're exposed. These are not in a high tunnel. They're not in a greenhouse. So they're going to get whatever the elements throw at them. That means when it rains, they're going to get watered from above. And honestly, you may also notice that I don't have drip irrigation, which means when I water them, to some extent, they're going to get watered from above too. But as we've already mentioned, tomato plants are very prone to disease. And disease really likes to spread in wet conditions, specifically when the leaves of the tomato plants are damp. That allows the spores of disease to really take hold in the leaves and to really multiply. So we want to minimize wet foliage as much as possible. As I said, there's nothing you can do to control the rain. You know, if you don't have a drip irrigation system and you're going to be watering from a sprinkler or a hose or something like that, you can't completely keep the leaves of the tomato plants dry. So this isn't something that I stress about. This is just something it's just something to be aware of. It's something that I try to do the best that I can. Because it's the roots that need the moisture, not the leaves. So by keeping the leaves as dry as possible, watering basically the soil and the roots as much as possible, and trying to minimize water contact with the leaves, that's just a little step that we can take to keep our tomato plants healthy as long as possible. So let's talk a little bit about pest management. You can see I have this little creature here that is making little holes in my tomato leaves, and I'll tell you exactly what I'm planning to do about this little bug. In this case, the answer is nothing. Now you're going to have to, when it comes to pest control, you're going to have to assess the damage that a particular pest is doing or a particular pest has the ability to do and determine if it's worth responding to. Now in my case, growing organically, and honestly I want to say even better than organically because I prefer to not even use organic sprays in my garden. I like to keep my garden completely no spray as much as possible. Now there's the occasional exception where I will use some natural or organic pest control, but for the most part, I prefer to let nature handle it. Now, if it's something like a tomato hornworm, that's a different story than that little beetle that we saw over there. That little beetle will make a couple little holes in the leaves. That's not going to do any significant damage to my tomato crop. It's not going to really impact my tomato harvest. A tomato hornworm, on the other hand, can eat an entire tomato plant down to nothing in a matter of a couple days. That is something that I would address. But I would address something like that by hand picking. The thing with tomato hornworms is that they tend to be larger pests. There's not going to be necessarily as many of them. There'll be fewer. They can be a little bit tricky to spot because they are green and they blend in with the green leaves. But personally in my garden, I have not had a significant issue with tomato hornworms. I've had a couple years where I've had maybe 2 or 3. I've never had any significant losses to them. So honestly, that's not something that I really deal with. In my garden, the biggest threat to tomato plants that I deal with is disease. I have never had a significant pest issue. So I may not be the best person to really help you with advice about dealing with tomato pests, but my biggest advice is just to keep your plants healthy and just to continue meeting the needs of the plants. That alone is going to go a long way towards minimizing pest damage. So those are my top tomato care tips that I wanted to share with you today. As you can see, my tomatoes are starting to flower and hopefully won't be too long before we have lots of delicious tomatoes to harvest. So I'll be sure to keep you updated on the growth of my tomatoes as the season goes on. We'll do garden tours and I'll show you how the tomatoes are going. I'm hoping to be able to do some nice harvest videos as well, where we get to harvest and enjoy lots of these tomatoes. So I hope that these tomato care tips were helpful for you. If you have any other tips for growing tomatoes that I forgot to mention, I would love to hear those in the comments below. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you next time. I'll see you soon.